Hello, everyone, and welcome to Utafiti Hub. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Njoki Mboshe. I'm your host for today. Today, we would like to discuss the vaccine issue. It's something that has been going on for a while, and we have received very many requests to discuss this issue, especially with respect to recent clips that have been circulating. We have had statements indicating that most corona tests or COVID-19 tests will be happening in Africa.
Cette étude en Afrique où il n'y a pas de masque, pas de traitement, pas de réanimation, un peu comme c'est fait d'ailleurs pour certaines études dans le sida, où chez les prostituées, on essaye des choses parce qu'on sait qu'elles sont hautement exposées et elles ne se protègent pas. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez ?
Alors vous avez raison, et d'ailleurs on est en train de réfléchir en parallèle à une étude en Afrique justement pour faire ce même type d'approche avec le BCG, un placebo. Je pense qu'il y a un appel d'offres qui est sorti, il va sortir, et je pense qu'on va en effet sérieusement réfléchir à ça aussi. Ça n'empêche pas qu'en parallèle on puisse réfléchir à une étude aussi en Europe et en Australie.
Now, if they don't get early quick results in the UK, they're considering a trial in Kenya where the epidemic of coronavirus may well be on the rise.
So people have requested that we have this debate today, but then we are able to debunk and separate emotion from objective discourse and from objective issues, and just to investigate whether there's any benefit to having this process undertaken in Africa and indeed in Kenya, and whether or not prejudice is likely to be suffered. So just to be able to have a candid, honest, and very objective conversation about the testing issue, especially with respect to the various vaccines, and closer home with respect to the latest COVID-19 pandemic. To be able to have this very conversation, we are today joined by three distinguished gentlemen. We have Dr. Moses Ndungu Mwangi, a pharmacist. He is also a vaccinologist. We also have Dr. Paul Ogendi. Dr. Ogendi is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya by profession. He is also a medical legal expert, and he teaches at the University of Nairobi School of Law. We have yet again Roland Ebole is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya by profession and an expert in the area of human rights, and also to thank all the people in the background and other experts who are able to assist this program run, especially this particular session, including Dr. Kevin Githui Mureithi. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for making time. And to start with you, Dr. Mwangi, Dr. Moses Mwangi, there has been many, as I have said, there has been many claims and many complaints by Kenyans and Africans about the clips circulating and about whether or not tests for vaccines should happen, and especially whether they should happen in Kenya. And many are saying that they're quite skeptical about it. So just to hear from you, Daktari, is there an institutional mechanism that will regulate this kind of process? So then people can, or should we actually be extremely skeptical about it?
Thank you very much, Joki, for having me. Just for the sake of clarity, Moses Mwangi, I have worked in the vaccine industry for more than 25 years. Before my current engagement, I worked with the world #1 vaccine company, and I've been involved here in Kenya in the issues of vaccine development. In fact, many of the vaccines currently in the Kenyan market, besides the traditional children vaccines that were there, I have been involved in one aspect or another, launching them. And round about 2000 or thereabout, in our system in Kenya, our kids were only receiving about 6 vaccines. And currently we have more than 22 diseases that are vaccine preventable. And I was involved, being in the industry, bringing together the healthcare sector at the Kenya Health Federation to get our doctors here and our institutes being involved in vaccine development, because I dare say in the last 100 years in the area of health sector, when we look at what has happened with regard to impact to health, the number one intervention that has contributed greatly to public health is introduction in a community of clean drinking water. The number two is vaccines. Not even the discovery of antibiotics at the beginning of the last century has had such an impact as vaccines. And where a vaccine exists, it is the best public health tool to use. And I think listeners will know that this dictum that says prevention is better than cure is something that came about between 1822 and 1895, when people like Louis Pasteur of France and Edward Jenner of the UK during the smallpox issues came about. And therefore, let's begin by saying to treat is good, to prevent is better. And where you have a vaccine, you need to use the vaccine. Number two, we need to say this: vaccines are used on healthy people. Unlike medicines that we use to treat people, vaccines are used on healthy people. And therefore, whereas we can tolerate some important adverse events when it comes to drugs, the tolerance on adverse events on vaccine, we want a vaccine that doesn't bring adverse events because we are giving it to a healthy person. That is to say that the medical industry and the medical healthcare sector over years and through conventions, international conventions, has defined the protocols that must be used in the trials of both the therapeutics intervention, which is what we call medicines or drugs, and preventive approach. So there are international conventions. And I am one of the guys who was involved in the 2000 all the way to 2010 in trying to lobby to create in our own country capabilities to be able to do trials for vaccines. I remember in 2004 starting the first influenza surveillance in Kenya for influenza. Then we started a small sentinel surveillance, which has grown, and thanks to that work, later on the CDC of the US came and invested heavily in laboratory development in Cambridge. And today we have the National Influenza Center. And thanks to that, as soon as COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, Kenya had the capacity through the National Influenza Center and the CDC laboratories in Cambridge to be able to diagnose. And that is how we are able to perform. And this work has happened over time. Now, coming to vaccine development, I need to say to you that there are several stages. We have what we call the preclinical stage, where if you have a candidate vaccine, and currently there are more than 100 candidate vaccines available that are being developed for COVID-19. You begin with the preclinical stage, where the candidate vaccine that you choose, you try it in a laboratory animal. And you check whether this candidate vaccine is, first of all, safe to this laboratory animal. Number two, whether it will elicit an immune response. That means that when you inject it, the animal will produce antibodies. And then once you have satisfied yourself at that point that this candidate vaccine can do what you as a designer wanted to do, you proceed now to the clinical development. And the clinical development has 4 phases. You have phase 1, where you use a few people, they could be 30 people or thereabout, where you test this vaccine to start with for safety. Because as I said, you have to be sure that this vaccine will be safe. So you test it for safety, and when you are satisfied, and of course you also monitor the immunogenicity or the ability to elicit an immune response, that you can do within a month. Because normally once you give a candidate vaccine, in 7 to 14 days, the body should give some antibodies, and you can measure them. You can be able to know how much you have multiplied your antibodies in the body against that particular agent. And in 30 days, 28 to 30 days, you have your answer. Then you go to the next stage, which is phase 2, where now you can have many more people. At this phase, you will be looking for advancing your study on safety, and much more now, measuring more carefully the ability to have an immune response in a bigger population. And this you can have a few hundred people. And I think that is the comment that may have come from the UK. I think that is the phase 2 now, where you can have 400, 500, a good number. When you test that vaccine at that level, and you are now satisfied, A, it is safe, B, it elicits a good enough immune response, and therefore it can protect a person, you now go to phase 3, where you will need to test it in. Phase 3 is where you now test the candidate vaccine, involving thousands of people in multi-center kind of a thing. That means that you don't test it in one center, in different geographic region, touching different people group, because the way a vaccine or a drug can work in a Caucasian may not be exactly the way it will work in a black person, or the way it will work in an Asian person. So for a vaccine that would be used globally, it would be tried in a multi-center, different geographical areas. Of course, there are some vaccines that may be specific for certain regions. For example, recently in the last few years, we had Ebola, which was a problem in Africa. So that trial would be done in Africa. But when we talk about COVID-19, this is a global problem. So any vaccine that will be used must be tried in the different people groups around the world. And then when you pass through now phase 3, you prove in phase 3, you prove immunogenicity, that is ability to elicit an immune response to a good level where you have protection. You prove, again, safety. Safety we started in phase 1, in preclinical, in animal model, in humans in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And then at that point, you adjust the dose, how the dosing is going to be. Then we now go to phase 4, which is where now the vaccine is distributed widely. And even then we continue to monitor its efficacy. Having established that, I think it is very, very important for people to understand that if Africa is going to use any vaccine against COVID, a trial must be done in Africa. And I must say that most of the vaccine manufacturers today are in Europe. In fact, US has had to do catch up with regard to vaccine production. We have a few vaccine industry in, I think in India has Serum Institute of India. We have a few in Japan, but most of them are in Europe. And I think it's important to say, by the time a vaccine is going to be tried in another geographic location, it has gone through preclinical phase 1. We are probably in phase 2 now for that particular vaccine. Let me conclude by saying this. In normal times, it takes about 10 years from the time you identify a candidate vaccine and you see it's working in an animal model to the time you commercialize it. The average is about 10 point something years. But now we have a pandemic. We have a pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. We had a disaster with Ebola. Sometimes the scientists can calibrate and fast track some of the investigations. And COVID-19 is a coronavirus. It is a different coronavirus from the common cold virus. It's slightly different from SARS, and we had an outbreak of SARS in 2003, which mainly affected Asia, Hong Kong, and other places. In between, we had Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS. So, as medical scientists, we are not encountering coronavirus for the first time. A lot of work was done with SARS, a lot of work was done with MERS, and therefore, this is why you hear us saying it is possible to imagine we can have a vaccine in 18 months, because a lot of work have been done with the previous coronaviruses. Kenya, we are very privileged. As I have mentioned, we have developed capacity.
Yeah, and just a minute, Daktari, and we are going to get to that point of capacity. I would just like to get the reactions of Roland and Paul with respect to what Daktari has said. About especially the issue of how many years it could take to develop, and he explains, of course, that we have had various interactions over the years, but also now, you know, in addition to what he has said, and as you're responding to that, the fact that the first case of COVID-19 in particular was reported in December. We are now in April towards the end. It's about 4 or 5 months. So do you think, again, going back to the same question I asked Dr. Moses, do we have the institutional mechanism? Do we have the institutional mechanism to be able to make sure, especially noting that the vaccines, as he has indicated, are more or less generated from outside the country and outside of Africa? Do we have the capacity, the institutional systems to make sure that that we are not the priority of Africa and the priority of Kenya is not compromised? Perhaps we can start with Roland and then we'll get to Dr. Ongedi.
And thank you very much, Dr. Mwangi. There's a lot of perspective that you brought into this discussion. And of course, I totally agree with you that vaccination is continued to be regarded as the most effective and cheapest medical intervention through, you know, as in anything like a disease and all that. Prevention is definitely better than cure at any time. I'm also at pains to really know whether there are really conventions, because convention is really such a strong word with regards to vaccine. I know there is one in terms of for the institution of some international vaccine. I think it's a UN body. There was actually as an agreement that state signed with regards to that. So maybe I'd really want to know what these conventions are, and it would be interesting for us to really look at what they provide and the kind of protection or you know, they have to people. Second, it's very important that you've actually mentioned you know, the process of developing a vaccine, and I'm really impressed, and I have started reading through it as well. When Cambridge does some of this, you know, the development of vaccines, it's normally done, you know, alongside many other global partners, and at no one point would a vaccine be administered or a trial without, you know, the Institute for the CDCs and KEMRI and other bodies like the Influenza Institute knowing. And I think this is a very good point. I think the point that we really need to hold a lot of emphasis on is whenever any process happens, what are these ethical considerations that we need to always note? What are the human rights considerations that we need to note, especially when trials are agreed? Of course, they're agreed at different levels within the government. Of course, there is, government to government or institutions agreeing on this. Of course, we are ready for this. And that may be assumed to be some level of consultation. Yet these trials sometimes come to individuals. And I know there are issues of consultation that happen with individuals in some cases, but again, going into the degree of what does that consultation mean in terms of were people really fully informed, were they fully aware of what trials or whatever it is really does mean to them. So issues about prior and informed consent, issues around as another ethical issues around what the vaccine really, how the selected, population to be tried will be as an achieved that. I think my consideration was on the ethical issues around, any trial that happens in any part of the world, not just Africa, and that is issues of prior and informed consent, issues of the selection of, the sample. I also mentioned a bit to do with, the issue of the bigger question or the bigger worry not being, issue about trials happening in Africa. If the trials will follow the ethical steps and the required procedures, then it's still okay. But now we also look at the issue of the patenting as the next big discussion that we need to have, because we've got no other ways. The vaccine is being developed and it's supposed to help all of us. So what's the next question whereby we participate or every process goes on and then the countries or institutions in European countries or wherever they come from that, produce or are able to get, this vaccine, patent it and makes it not accessible to, to everyone and especially the poor, then the question of the human rights of access to health comes back.
I think the main question that we have to ask is whether or not African countries should participate in clinical trial research. And I say that the context of this discussion happened when we saw interviews in the UK and France. And the response was that African countries were being treated as guinea pigs. Now, this has brought about this present discussion. And that it is important also to know that clinical research is not the same as clinical practice. Now, clinical research is usually done in order to generate knowledge, okay? And this knowledge is supposed to be on whether or not a particular intervention can actually help you acquire the immunity you need to prevent diseases. Now, clinical practice is usually done in order to benefit the patient in terms of treatment, okay? So that's why we have two categories of clinicians. One is in research, and the other one is in practice. So in the context of clinical research, which is about knowledge generation, the balance is usually on two aspects. The first part is on the need to promote knowledge generation. The second part is to protect and respect human subjects. So because there are risks inherent in vaccine trials and everything, this becomes a very important part also. So you have to balance these two competing goals or objectives. Now, how do you do that? The ethical principles that have been able to be developed over the years to try and make sure that even as we generate knowledge, we are able to also protect and respect the human subjects. At the center of all this is the informed consent, okay? Whereby you have to ensure that anyone who is participating in clinical trials research has given you their consent, not just from a point of ignorance, but also from a point of knowledge of what this whole research is about. Other principles that are applicable include that there must be a valuable scientific question. So in the context of the proposed clinical trials, the question is, they want to know whether the interventions proposed can actually contribute to the COVID-19 fight or war in terms of building immunity. The other is social value. What is it that we are going to get as a society out of all this research? Then fair subject selection. Fair subject selection means that you must include everyone who is supposed to be in that clinical research. So like I had mentioned before, Dr. Mwangi had said that this COVID-19 has affected the whole world. So we expect that Africans also, when there's a clinical trial ongoing, there must be research participants from Africa, so that we're able to see how the vaccine also behaves. Then others include favorable risk-benefit evaluation. So you must be able to evaluate the risk and benefits and therefore give the favor to the participants. Independent review. Other people who, like the experts in this field, should be able to review your processes. And then lastly, respect for enrolled subject. And this, I said, includes what we call withdrawal. You can withdraw your consent anytime, okay? And also to be treated in a good manner. Now, there is another perspective that I wanted to bring on board, which is that many people can choose to view research as a burden. And when you do that, you focus on protection. So the question is, how do you protect those who are bearing the burden of the research? Others can view research as a benefit. And particularly in my studies, I focus on access to medical technologies and innovations. So whatever comes out of this process of vaccine trials, the question now becomes who accesses it and how. So we say that if we are stakeholders in this, there is a high likelihood that the participants who are in this clinical research process will have direct benefits by virtue of being in the study. In other words, they will have a faster access to the vaccine that has been developed through this process. But that should also be conditioned to minimizing the risk as much as possible. And all this that I've talked about are not my words. They are words that have been codified in different testaments. And I will highlight about 6 of them. The first one is the Nuremberg Code of 1949. This was established or was put in place in the context of war. And the question was whether you can do research or clinical trials on prisoners of war. And one of the main principles that were established at that time, or one of the main ethical principles that were established at that time, was that voluntary consent of human subject is absolutely essential. In other words, there's no negotiation. It must be voluntary, okay? And it must be consent that is obtained in a good manner. The other one is the Declaration of Helsinki, which was enacted in 1964, 2000, and then 2008. So the general population, it deals with the, I think Dr. Mwangi said, ethical medical research in the general population, okay? Then we have a report which is also important, particularly in the West, the Belmont Report, which was enacted in 1979, that came with a view of a particular ethical principles to be used. And I mentioned those to include something to do with respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Beneficence means beneficial factor. Then other instruments that can be looked at is the Council for International Organization of Medical Sciences, CIOMS, and WHO International Guidelines of 1993, and then 2002, which actually came up with developing world principles. So it focused mainly on how to conduct clinical trials in the context of developing world, and Africa belongs here mainly. In other countries, particularly the ICH countries, the International Council for Harmonization, there's what we call good clinical practices. So those are available also, and it is aimed at harmonizing rules so that when you do a clinical trial in one country of an ICH member, that trial is as good as in any other country, so that you don't have different standards. So the focus there is on harmonization, and which will improve access of the medical technology. FDA, I think, has its own independent regulations, and therefore all this can be found there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. And you know, and it's really important for everyone of our viewers to be able to understand that indeed we do have instruments that then are able to take care of these various aspects. Just to get it from Dr. Mwangi, Dr. Moses Mwangi, having heard of the instruments, now the question that we keep coming back to, that Kenyans really are asking and that many people in Africa are asking, while we have those good instruments that talk about that, all that, do we have the capacity to actually be able to actualize all these standards that we are being told we need to adhere to? So then, as Kenyans and as Africans, what confidence should we have that whatever it is that is being done in Kenya and in Africa is the same thing in terms of standards that is being done in the UK?
Thank you very much. Let me say this. For many, many years, and as I said, I worked in the vaccine industry for 25 years. And during the last, I would say, 25, 30 years, Kenya has come a long way. If you look at African countries that have participated in global trials for vaccines and drugs, you begin with countries like South Africa. You go north to countries in Francophone Africa, like Senegal, with the Pasteur Institute, like Algeria and Tunisia. And I remember somewhere mid 2004, 2005, really struggling to, among others, to lobby for especially vaccine trials to be done in Kenya. And I think if you look at KEMRI, which has come a long way with the centers in Nairobi, in Kisumu, in Kilifi, and now we are going into Kirinyaga. And that institute has very high capacity in terms of research. And it's a medical research institute. And over the years, we have honed skills. Many of you legal professionals in this forum are from the University of Nairobi and my alma mater. The School of Medicine has developed capacity. We even have a kind of a vaccine institute there, headed by very able virologists who have been doing research. And in the area of malaria vaccine, we have been looking for a malaria vaccine for very long. And I dare say, in medical science, we've come a long way when it comes to vaccines against viruses. We have very many. Every time there's a viral disease, the best tool to deal with a virus is a vaccine, and we know how to make them. Don't mind that it's taken us very long to find a vaccine against HIV for various reasons. We have a number of vaccines against bacterial diseases, a few of them, not very many. When it comes to parasites like malaria, we have many challenges. And Kenya, among other African countries, in collaboration with other universities of international repute in the UK, in the US, has been able to work and develop a malaria vaccine. At the moment, it's a good vaccine, but it's not the best, but it's actually a malaria vaccine. And this capacity has developed so that today, I dare say, Kenya can sit among the nations of the world as one country that has the human capacity and the necessary infrastructure. I remember in 2004 when I was privileged to initiate something about influenza surveillance network in Nairobi that has now grown to what we call the National Influenza Center. It was difficult, but today, even influenza centers, we have them across the country. We have the human capacity. We have the necessary equipment to do that. So, and all these trials, again, there are ethical committees to approve any trial. These ethical committees are at different level. They are in medical research institutes. They are in universities like the University of Nairobi, the Moi Teaching and Referral, and also in the government, the ministry that houses science and technology. Ethical approval. So, to say the least, I think as a country, we should be very proud that when there are discussions taking place globally, people think and know that Kenya has capacity.
I'd like to hear Roland's perspective on this, from the human rights perspective here. Having heard what the rest has said, Roland, do you get the feeling that our checklist in terms of anyone who either is suffering from COVID or has someone who is suffering from COVID or even any other kind of ailment or disease in Kenya or even in Africa, do we feel confident in terms of the human rights requirements or elements with respect to what we are hearing about our capacity as Kenya and our capacity as Africa?
I've talked, and Dr. Ogen just talked about ethical issues, and we've talked about informed consent. Yeah, and the consent really has to be, in such, deep information with regards to effects and, reasons and all that, in a way that any person that wants to opt out also has that, leeway, and all that. But again, I'm thinking with regards to everything that everyone has said, including Dr. Mwangi, the problem with us sometimes it's, access to this information or how this information is conveyed out. For instance, these discussions are on a progressive stage. Our scientists are already talking to scientists in Europe. Our KEMRI is already collaborating with other global institutions. But you see how the president came out on Saturday was one to say that there are no trials going on. Very true. That is correct. Second, he went ahead to say that yes, we have KEMRI that is already doing a lot with regards to developing some of these vaccines that we are thinking about, and when we'll be ready to do anything with Kenyans, we shall let you know. There is a lot of information that is missing there with regards to how this collaboration is going on, because it seems somewhere that there's already some form of a decision or some form of an agreement. Once this thing is actually ready, we will be coming to Kenya. So the point is, when we want to inform people, when we want to get buy-in, for instance, a normal person will not understand how the process of developing a vaccine works as well as how Dr. Mwangi has explained. But there are ways in which you can actually, at this point especially, taking advantage of this situation and the discussion, rumors, the theories around COVID-19 and the vaccines be developed to get people to understand what these processes are in very, short bullets or in very, very simplistic way in which our people can take, this to be. So ethical issues are very important, very, very, very important. It does not matter how far we are in terms of our capacity, how we've collaborated with others. We must go back to it. We must look at how these other vaccines or vaccination trials or whatever has been happening in the past have been conducted. When we go back to the past, then we're able to see, yes, these things have been very, they've been conducted in, with good ethics, and every procedure in the book, both within our laws and international law, was followed. What can we learn from that, even as we move and on to the next? Lastly, on issues about capacity, I would like a situation in which we invest in health in such a great way that our capacity is not that we've got, the resources just in terms of, the contextual environment where, the diseases or whatever it is are found, the parasites are found, and the knowledge with regards to our people, a capacity in terms of financial resources, whereby even after the development of the vaccines, we are able now to process. And that is what I'm insisting on in terms of, yes, it is developed. Yes, some of the beneficiaries are, where the trials were conducted. But what does it mean in terms of our capacity to continue developing? And this is where we go back even to our own regional, treaties and conventions, like the Abuja Protocol of, almost 20 years ago, that, it requires governments, African states, to devote more than 15%, that is at least 15% of their, annual budgets to health. When do we get to a situation whereby we just don't participate as, our muscles on development of the vaccines, but now to the process whereby everything health we can finance, we have the capacity. It's not just our brains, it's not just the context of where this thing is found, but we can really push and sit at the same tables in terms of even the processing and having the patent rights and having, all that. That is what you refer to when you say capacity, not just, joining into the process and being dropped at a certain stage where now people want to take ownership, where people now want to take, the credit for now selling and supplying the vaccines. I think that is my point to that.
Thanks so much, Roland. And just to get back to you, Dr. Ogendi, one of the things that we got from the people who, requested for this conversation was the race perspective. So that then it was felt as if the statement was, we are coming to do this in Africa. So what is the race angle? Do you get a race feel in all these debates that are going on with respect to this? And what is your take on that particular issue?
Yes, I think it's a very dicey issue. It's not something I can really interpret in a very academic way. But I think one of the things that I've said is that, like Roland has said, there are human rights implications and ethical implications. Human rights implications include the right to information and transparency, public participation, should we have this research in the country or not, and also right to property, and I think that's what you meant when you mentioned patents. Human rights issues that are coming up are very important. So the question is, would we be opposed to this if we had the right information? Would we be opposed to this if we participated in making the decision of having this vaccine in our country? Or would we have opposed to this if the vaccine are going to be our property? So you see how I'm linking this, that the lack of the human rights in the process of vaccine trials has brought about illegitimacy. Therefore, everybody is hostile to this process, not because it's a bad thing or it's unethical, but because the human rights angle has not been sufficiently addressed. If you ask me, if you give people information, you make it transparent, you will have public participation happen, and you guarantee right to property, everybody will be happy.
Indeed, thank you so much, Daktari, because that is actually one of the reasons as to why we are having this particular conversation today, because to make sure that people then understand the context within which these things are running. So then back to you, Dr. Moses Mwangi. how often, as a person who is actively in this industry, have you then come across this race debate, especially at the testing stage? And perhaps how have you been able to deal with it over your 25 years?
Now, with regard to race, I think we are in a pandemic that is global. I think it's the first time. I think our generation has not experienced this, and I doubt whether we shall experience, those of us who are talking here, another one in our lifetime. And so this conversation about having public participation in a vaccine trial. I mean, we've been doing vaccine trials in Kenya and in Africa for many years, following the protocols that have been very well outlined by Dr. Ogedi, properly, under proper supervision by our governments. But now, because we're in a pandemic situation and everybody is affected, because a comment was made by a Caucasian somewhere in Europe, and I think maybe when he looks at it, he might regret why he said what he said, but looking at it in the perspective of the ethics of medical trials, I can guarantee you that, all the conventions are followed. And I would like to express to my African colleagues and say this: Africa is on the table. If you look at the UN organs, the top UN organs, 2 of them are headed by Africans. The WHO Director General is an African from Ethiopia, Dr. Tedros. The UNCTAD Director General is a fellow Kenyan. Africa is on the table. And I believe we are in a scenario where, as Africans, we should feel that we are represented at that global level. Now, there is something to do when it comes to engaging our communities. And I think if I can speak what I've seen in Kenya, I think our president has been has done quite well in communicating to us and the CS for Health, because, you know, if the community is not well engaged in this particular pandemic, it can be disastrous. And we have seen that in other countries where people are protesting. And I think for the whole story of vaccine trials, I think, as Dr. Ogedi mentioned, the country where a vaccine is manufactured, they get the first right. The next right to access would be countries that participated in the vaccine development. And that is where I see that although there is that ratio inclination, and I think I would like to persuade my fellow Africans to look at this issue as a scenario where Kenya is elevated to a table to speak on the same length as the UK, France, US, when it comes to ability to, capacity to do research. But I also want to agree, and I really would like to agree to our government, to ask our government and African governments to fund research, because organs like KEMRI, they have the human capacity and the capability. But what we lack is funding. And therefore, the kind of funding we currently have there are funding that are coming through international global networks. And for that matter, you can be at a weaker point in terms of negotiating for what happens thereafter. So I think in my mind, we are living in very unusual times. And I think having told you that Africa is on the table, heading 2 units in the UN, I think as Africans, we should feel that we are not being discriminated anymore with regard to even this.
Well, okay, thank you very much. And I agree with you. We are seated at the table, but again, we do acknowledge that he who pays the piper calls the tune, and that therefore sometimes you may be at the table, but it's almost always or quite often boils down to a resource issue. And I also agree with you on the research aspect. And it's like you say also with respect to the communication angle that it's important for people to understand some of these things. Roland, what do you have to say about what Dr. has said?
No, it goes back to my point, and I think Dr. has contradicted himself initially, where he said that we have the capacity, we sit, at the same table, we have equal muscles through this. Then later on, he says that research is poorly funded. Yes, we bring in human resource, we've got a lot of brains, but we do not have, the government is not funding. And I had gone into their, issues around the Abuja Protocol, just our continental agreement with regards to fund health. And I'm thinking about health and aspects as in around research, as in and all that, so that at least once we have, that resource and we have the capacity, then we can rightfully sit on the table and take ownership. And that is what we are talking about. One of the ways in which you could have really, defended the racial card thing is that already 800 people in the UK have already volunteered themselves for trial. And we saw as early as, 23rd April, one woman had already been injected for, some of these trials. So yes, we as Africans cannot cry that it's, there's a racial kind of administration of, or the process in terms of thinking of administration of these trials. The trials are happening all over. It is only that we saw one clip on a BBC news or discussion, or we saw another clip of a French doctor saying Africa, but we are not able to understand, in context that these trials already happening in the UK, trials already happening somewhere else and somewhere else, so that our discussion becomes of when it comes to us, or when you start discussing about us, then involve us, not that why Africa, because it's happening everywhere else. So that would have been very useful. The discussion around, the right to information around this time is extremely useful. And part of it is to explain what I've just said. But beyond that, to explain what you are saying in terms of, the first consideration once we have the vaccine out, or once we have this out, is, the populations that really participated, those that were involved. Once we have our communities knowing this, then they become more interested in being part of this. Information, useful information gives legitimacy to any processes anywhere. I believe that the president and the minister for health and others within that, the health docket, they have done a lot in as far as giving us information about coronavirus, giving us information about state measures, giving us warnings and cautions about state measures, but they've not done a lot in terms of getting us to know of this vaccine process. Once we invest in getting the community behind us, then we have started a useful process of informed consent, a useful process of them understanding what they're getting themselves into. Then we'll go into all the other issues later. But beyond that, what you've said important, let us fund our health systems. And this should be a lesson post-COVID-19.
And indeed, Roland, I agree with you on many points there. Just to add that 1 or 2 videos is one too many. And as we are wrapping up, perhaps, and for, I'll give about a minute or 2 to each one of us. Given that these videos that we're talking about, this COVID situation is what has brought about this conversation. It is what our viewers have requested to have this debate about and this session about. What message should be sent to Kenyans? We have all agreed that useful information gives legitimacy, or deliberately and objectively delegitimizes a process. So what do you think Kenyans should bear in mind, even as we are having these conversations and debates on the streets and anywhere else and at the policy table? What should they have in mind, Dr. Ogendi?
So number one, Kenyans should remember that COVID-19 has affected everyone.
Oh, just
and Africans.
And Africans.
Yes, has affected Africans and Kenya, to be specific. So we are all in the race to find solutions. Different countries have done their bit Many countries have excelled in coming up with the interventions. African countries are also in the process of coming up with their own interventions, but they are taking longer. To the extent that these other countries have already come up with interventions, we are obligated, in fact, by virtue of being members of the World Health Organization. If you look at the international health regulations, there's what we call international cooperation and sharing. And indeed, there are various programs that are being implemented. So if indeed we are part of the WHO, then we're also obligated to cooperate. And if these countries that have developed vaccines call on us to participate in clinical trials, we are legally obligated, or not legally per se, but we are supposed to cooperate with them, because if these vaccines are actually effective, then it means that we would have contributed to the process of coming up with a vaccine, and therefore we can lay claim to its success. Otherwise, if we refuse to participate in the process, we could have challenges in the future. One, in terms of delaying the process of developing the vaccine, and number two, perhaps in terms of its actual access, because other countries might take an opportunity also to teach you a lesson or two. But that usually never happens in real life. But we don't want to find ourselves in that position. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Moses Moiti.
I think one of the ways in which we could do better as a country is to bring on board in the conversation on COVID some of our eloquent researchers to be able to contribute to the conversation, because they are able to appreciate where we are at the level of clinical development of the various intervention tools, whether it is therapeutics or it is vaccines. And I think that could help in strengthening the communication of our government. Having said that, I think Kenya is a proud member of the World Health Organization, and I think as a country we should really embrace the fact that we are considered as a power in Eastern Africa and in this part of the world with regard to research and medical health care. I couldn't add more to say how badly we need to strengthen our healthcare systems, and to see doctors, being much more involved in at the front line in creating this conversation, so that we can remove the bad elements that come in of making the communities not have confidence. It's very important we have confidence so that we can overcome. My last point is this: with regard to COVID-19 in Africa, in Kenya, we don't know exactly where we are in terms of how far we shall go. So far, so good as a country. And but whatever the case, we will need a vaccine, and we would better be part and parcel of that vaccine development.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roland.
My parting shot is that let us truly sit at that table, if we are at that table. While European doctors are talking to international media, let us get our doctors, our researchers out there as well to say what we are thinking about the research moving forward. That is the only way in which we shall sit at the right table, when our citizens feel that we are sitting at that right table. For as long as they are not feeling, they're thinking the agenda is being driven by someone else. I was very, very worried a few weeks ago, knowing that CDC, we have a center for CDC in Kenya, we have Cambridge in Kenya. When Governor Mutua of Machakos made a lot of noise about our researchers, saying that they should step up and do more during this COVID-19, prove themselves, yet there is a lot that is going on. It means that at the level of governance, at the level of elite people in our country, if they do not understand the much that is going on, there is something amiss about the information or the confidence that we have with our research institutions, the confidence that we have with our researchers, and the confidence that we have with our health systems. Why don't we strengthen that? Once we strengthen that, once we get our place, our rightful place at every table, whether we are represented at the WHO by an African is an issue if at all we do not have the voice. We have seen many institutions whereby they have been led by people who have not had a voice. And so for us to have that voice is to make sure that we bang the tables as hard as everyone else so that we are in the information generation, we give information about what we are doing. That way, confidence in everything that we are doing will be returned. I think that is my parting shot.
Thank you so much, our very eloquent panelists, for your contributions. Indeed, it's very important, as we have all said, that as Africa, as Kenya, it is important for us to sit at the table, but not just sit there, but also be able to influence the decisions that are made, to be able to also benefit from the decisions that are made. And that is also the best way that our Wanjiko or anyone else from any other part of Africa and indeed the world will be able to have confidence in this particular process. Because by the end of the day, many can choose, as we have also agreed, to look at it either as a burden or benefit. But it mainly depends on the information that people have, because as we have all agreed, it is the information that either legitimizes or delegitimizes a process. Therefore, let us invest, as we have all agreed again, in our capacity as Kenya, our capacity as Africa, our capacity as the world. And even as we are doing that, let us make sure as much as possible that we are also able to share the information in terms of everything that is happening around the world and in terms of the processes that we are participating in. No man is an island. Kenya is not an island. We may not have as high figures today as Italy has, but who knows, God forbid, about tomorrow, not just about COVID-19, but with respect to any other process. But yet again, let it not be a process of fear-mongering. Let it not be that Africa or Kenya is being told, you will need us in future. Let us be able to equally be able to participate, because every life matters, be it a Kenyan life, be it an African life, or any other life in this world. And therefore, very important once again for the Kenyan African professionals to be able to speak out and speak up. And I thank all the viewers today and all those who requested for this conversation, because then we are able to see that as Kenya as Africa, we do have capacity. Let us hear this capacity so that then we don't speak from a point of oppression, but are therefore able to speak from a point of authority and not feel as if we are being bullied. Thank you so much, everyone, for making time. We look forward to having you next time. Utafiti Hub, capacity through many lenses. Please remember to subscribe and do send us your views as much as you can. Thank you very much. And thank you all, our panelists.